Hello and welcome back to part 2 on the addiction epidemic today. In part 1, I spoke to the alcohol, methamphetamine, and cocaine epidemics. I mentioned that there are many addiction epidemics simultaneously affecting the world's people. But for these episodes, I'm just focusing on the substance addiction epidemic. In this second half now, I will jump right into the opioid and fentanyl epidemics. And then I will discuss the layers of crisis within this epidemic and touch on the heart of the solution from an individual perspective at the end. So, moving next to the largest addiction epidemic, the opioid epidemic. Opiates or opioids, to account for synthetics too, are derived from the opium of the poppy plant, a plant that dates back as far as recorded history. Beginning in Mesopotamia, records show that the Sumerians, Assyrians, and then ancient Egyptians, Indians, Greeks, Arabs, and Venetians were growing and using opium. These early civilizations understood the poisonous and fatal effects, as well as the addictive properties. However, the benefits to soothe pain and sorrow, induce sleep, and lift mood were deemed worth it. Opium was a prized possession that had its cautions. In the 1500s, an opium alcohol tincture called laudanum was created by a Swiss-German alchemist, Paracelsus, and further developed by other scientists such as English physician Thomas Sydenham in the 1660s, modifying the tincture with a variety of different herbs, spices, and psychoactive plant properties too. Laudanum, still around today, has been used for medical purposes for centuries. In the West, laudanum was said to arrive with the Mayflower in 1620, noted as the first appearance of opium to the United States of America. Heading more toward current times, the spread of opium followed what is referred to as the Silk Road, which were interconnected routes running between Europe's Mediterranean and Asia and in and out of China in the 1800s. In the early 1800s, German pharmacist Friedrich Serturner isolated the sleep-inducing element in opium and named it morphine. It turns out morphine was more potent than opium in reducing pain and helping people feel better faster, and a better product for travel and trade too. Now, due to countless wars in the 1800s, opium spread nation to nation as countries were driven to produce their own morphine to support the thousands of soldiers and people who were addicted and in pain. The two most notable wars directly over opium are known as the Opium Wars in China, which are believed to have started the first worldwide opiate epidemic. After conquering large regions of poppy-growing fields in India, the British forced China to sell these goods to take back to Europe. Now, although the heart of China fought back, they lost both opium wars in the 1800s to the British and the French empires, which had teamed up with China's underground to keep the opium trafficking routes open through Hong Kong. Eventually, China took over and started to produce opium and opiates themselves, and they began making deals with other countries. Hong Kong became the drug trading capital of the world, where gold was exchanged for opium. Mainstream companies were then established or bought out to distribute drugs and to collect money, making transactions easier between countries. During the 1849 gold rush in San Francisco, Chinese immigrants flooded the U.S. to work on the railroad, bringing with them the habit of smoking opium. They created opium dens in established Chinatowns throughout the West, spreading opium into American culture. San Francisco was the first to set regulations against opium use, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a 10-year ban on Chinese immigration. As I have touched on, the great upsurge of opiates began in the 1850s, leading to the first opiate epidemic. And in addition to recreational use, morphine was being manufactured into narcotic pain pills in the United States. Morphine was the most popular painkiller during the Civil War, resulting in an estimated 400,000 soldiers becoming addicted. Post-Civil War, due to the dangers of addiction, scientists sought after a less addictive substance, and in the 1890s refined heroin from morphine as a safer alternative, only to later discover or admit that it was twice as powerful. By the 1890s, the pharmaceutical company Bayer was marketing heroin as a medical treatment to children and adults. Other companies, too, were adding their secret ingredients of cocaine, morphine, and heroin in many over-the-counter medications and products, including products for infants. As a result, opium hit its peak in the 1890s, and heroin addiction rates in the United States and Europe rose immensely well into the 1900s. But where was all this opium coming from? According to Joseph Douglas in his book Red Cocaine, in 1928, now the former Chinese communist dictator Mao Zedong began cultivating large quantities of opium in Asia. Douglas states that from the beginning, Mao's intentions for the mass harvest of opium was a planned chemical warfare against non-communists. By then, Mao would have known about the potential to leverage as well as the dangers of morphine and heroin to support a mission of this caliber. This drug operation by Mao, to consist of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana in the least, helped bring him into power in 1949 when he became China's leader of the Communist Party. As I mentioned in part 1 of this episode, the Chinese Communist Party worked with the Soviet communists to undermine American culture by any means necessary. And they worked through other countries that were less likely to be suspected of drug trafficking and targeted not only adults of the free world, but also the youth big time. They used propaganda, disinformation, and deception to create wars and project problems onto other organizations and individuals. They attacked the free countries, specifically the United States, at a political, economic, religious, and community level. But they instilled their communist ideology in a new way, using a revolutionary approach through many different avenues, such as through the educational system, the labor force, and media and entertainment. They leveraged sensitive subjects in society to forge a counterculture movement that endorsed and encouraged the use of drugs to promote so-called civil rights. Hence, the revolution in the 1960s, which is a whole different subject matter. Meanwhile, by the 1930s, New York became a hub for heroin trafficking, coming from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The Italian gangs are said to have taken over and largely pioneered the drug operation in New York that still continues today. They utilized immigrant and Black communities to deal their drugs as far as they could reach, and they taught people how to inject their version of heroin for a better euphoric experience. Heroin was great for underground business. It was cheaper to make and easier to get people hooked, with a higher frequency of need to return back to their dealers. As Sam Quinones points out in his book Dreamland, the true tale of America's opiate epidemic, addicts became slaves. They had no free will. So the Italian mob made millions, stretching out to multiple cities for decades to come at the cost of countless American lives. Concurrently, in 1952, Arthur Saxler and family purchased Purdue Pharma, first generating $100 million in sales for selling Valium, followed by the release of morphine in 1984 and OxyContin in 1996. Purdue Pharma and other big pharmaceutical companies like Teva Pharmaceutical and Johnson & Johnson started aggressively over-marketing the benefits of narcotic pain medications and funding studies to lend in their favor. They told doctors that they were under-prescribing their pain medication, and then they encouraged and even rewarded them for prescribing them, convincing them that good doctors ought to know that opiates come from Mother Nature and should be used to help people in pain. They also shared invalid studies that showed that less than 1% of people are likely to become addicted. Prescription opiates, they weren't designed to be cut off or the dosages reduced. And as a result, pain clinics by the hundreds started to emerge, and doctors were prescribing narcotic pain medication to just about anyone who asked or who was in pain. Hundreds of pills per person was not out of the ordinary. Clinics were making tens of millions of dollars annually. And it wasn't just the pharmaceutical companies lobbying either. Medical professionals and hospitals across the board were sending their patients to pain clinics, and they were backed by their medical boards as well. Come 2010, the consequences of these pain clinics, such as the enormous rates of addiction and death, could not be ignored. States started to file lawsuits against these pharmaceutical companies, and pain clinics too were being sued and being made to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for misrepresenting evidence and also for false advertising. And some physicians were sentenced for up to 20 years in prison for over-prescribing these pain medications and consequently causing people to die. Law enforcement stepped in to crack down on doctors. Pain clinics were either shut down or highly regulated. All scripts had to be documented, and only people with serious chronic pain could receive pain medication. With the great reduction of scripts being written, this sent massive amounts of people to the streets for drugs because they were addicted and the withdrawals were too much to bear. This led to a boom in heroin as well as black tar heroin on the streets. At the same time, the pain pill epidemic grew in the United States in the early 1980s. El Chapo's Mexican, Sinaloa, and Jalisco cartel made more heroin available on the streets. They targeted cities and rural communities operating in 17 states by about 2005, and by 2014 operating in at least 40 countries. El Chapo's cartel surpassed Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar, making over 14 billion total drug sales by the time of his arrest in 2016. Now, whether intentional or not, these operations were conveniently located next to populated pain pill mills, catching the patients who were addicted to Oxycontin, who either couldn't afford their prescription anymore or whose prescriptions suddenly ended, offering a guaranteed clientele who was already addicted to opiates. Now, on a side note, studies show that a good majority of people addicted to heroin first became addicted to prescription opiates. Back to Jalisco. Jalisco is known for introducing black tar heroin into the United States, starting in the West and working their way to the East Coast. They ran their operation through everyday shops like pizza delivery and did their best to stay out of the way of the American city gangs. This led them to small cities and rural communities everywhere, blending in with everyday people. Heroin made the cartel multi-millions of dollars annually, but it was costly to produce and it was challenging to traffic illegally. But around the turn of the century, a better solution emerged, which brought the world's most dangerous and most deadly drug onto the streets. This drug is called fentanyl, originally approved for terminally ill chronic pain patients or for anesthesia. Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate that is up to 50% stronger than heroin and 100% stronger than morphine, a potent drug that can be deadly even in microscopic amounts. It was invented in 1959 by Belgian physician Paul Janssen, even though it would be a few decades before it became a noticeable threat to society. So, an even bigger concern than the long history of methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin trafficking became fentanyl, which started to spike around 2014-2015. This is a drug that is disguised and cut into other street drugs, or it's just sold by its name. As reported in Ben Westhoff's book, Fentanyl Incorporated, China is the center of the new drug trade supplying much of the world's fentanyl. It is estimated that 90% of fentanyl is produced in one or more of China's known 400,000 chemical manufacturing laboratories. From here, it is shipped to the ports of Mexico into the hands of the Mexican cartel, where it is cut with additional ingredients without being tested and trafficked across the border into the United States, Or sometimes fentanyl is just shipped directly to the United States and Canada in a pure form and spread to large cities to be broken down and shared with dealers everywhere. It seems like nobody suspected or was prepared for the onset of fentanyl, but its presence was definitely noticed due to the exponential overdoses that happened at every level of society, including those at the top of the drug trade. Considering now the fatal potency of fentanyl, the enormous number of manufacturing sites in China, the lack of oversight and control by the Chinese Communist Party, and all the different fentanyl analogs of equal and greater risk, each with toxic additives, not to mention the fact that this is a drug that is cut into other street drugs and then disguised as heroin, oxys, cocaine, or methamphetamine, begs the question if fentanyl is more of a terrorist attack targeted at the free countries, not just another underground drug operation. And based on what we know about the drug trade manufacturers combined with today's evidence, you can be the judge. Regardless, one can observe this multi-layered drug trade as the largest epidemic on the surface of society. The drug trade and the drug addiction epidemic are not by accident. It was manufactured and driven into numerous countries around the world, targeting specifically the free countries and operating through different avenues in society. For instance, drug makers empowered underground mafias, mobs, and gangs to push the sale of drugs on the streets, to then incentivizing or forcing the hands of military officials and law enforcement, bringing them too on board, to backing certain medical and pharmaceutical operations over others, to fostering the present-day internet operations that involve a number of corporations and professionals in many industries to help run the illegal drug trade. What was once a violent street operation now runs all the way up through high-class circles, providing top-quality service to its customers. This means that people from all levels of society are in on it, even those you would least expect. The upsurge in opiate, heroin, and fentanyl addiction has continued to lead to exponentially more overdoses and deaths, more incarcerated parents and broken families, more infants being born opioid dependent, more children going into foster care, and more family dysfunction, where the problem repeats itself again with younger generations. Opioid addictions are all-consuming, taking over a person's mind, body, and soul, and prohibiting one's quality of life, not to mention one's opportunity to cultivate the true self and discover one's life purpose and mission. Statistics show on average one person dies of an opiate overdose every 10 minutes in the United States, or more than 130 people die per day from an opioid-related overdose. The rise in opiate epidemic is reported to begin somewhere in the early to mid-1990s, with fentanyl coming into society in the 2010s. 2015 was reported as the worst year for drug overdose deaths in history. 2016 and 2017 were increasingly worse. In 2016, 63,000 people died of an opioid overdose. And in 2017, over 70,000 people in the United States died of an opioid overdose. This is more deaths a year than the 58,000 soldiers who died in the Vietnam War, or the peak year of car accidents in 1972 when 55,000 people died, or the peak year of HIV or AIDS death, which was 43,000 in 1995, or the 40,000 people that died from guns in 1993. Generally speaking, addiction rates and drug-related deaths and overdoses have continued to increase exponentially since the 1990s. And sitting at the heart of this drug epidemic, we see a peak of fentanyl across the United States, Canada, Europe, and other parts of the world, shown to come mostly from China. As the economy, commercialism, and corporatization has developed in society, so has the drug trade. They too have developed their services, further scaling their operations to more people, offering more products at a better price point, at more convenience, and in easier to hide and transport ways. This makes fentanyl an appealing drug for many reasons. Fentanyl is easier and cheaper to produce, it is easier to hide in other things and to transport. It brings things to the next level that people addicted and in pain are seeking, and it shows to be the perfect tool for the devil and all the wicked factions that serve thee. When it comes to the drug trade, Ben Westhoff says in his book, Fentanyl Incorporated, quote, "The drug economy no longer just benefits the producers and dealers. Nowadays, it involves the otherwise innocent people who deliver our mail, who program internet algorithms, who develop medicines in chemical labs, and who scrub toilets at drug companies." The new drug trade is growing like all economies. Increasing communication speeds, internet technology, and shipping relax trade barriers and pressure for higher margins, end quote. So, if you want to understand today's addiction epidemic, well then just take a look at the drug trade to see how addiction is being manufactured. The prescription opioid epidemic itself became a multi-billion-dollar industry, not to mention the underground drug trade. We are talking billions and likely trillions of dollars moving between countries through the hands of global gangs to traffic not only drugs, but anything that pays of this caliber. This should make people wonder who owns all the money at the top, and who are the stakeholders that are benefiting and profiting, and why and what and where does all this money go? The above ground and underground drug trade is a known fact, and validated even by the constituents. However, mainstream media, or paid programming, weaves a softer, less concerning narrative, keeping the focus and problem projected on other things. The truth about the largest number of deaths, all the lost souls, and the regretted missed opportunities coming as a direct result of the drug trade, a targeted agenda and attack by the world's villains upon the world's people, has not been spoken about honestly by the mainstream. As a society, we have been conditioned to treat addiction in its final manifestation at the end result. And the blame is kept on the addicts, and then the families and communities, and even the treatment and punishment methods. But the conversation about who is behind the global drug trade, a trade long worth more than gold, responsible for more deaths under 50 than anything else in the surface of society, hasn't happened until now. In 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump declares the opioid crisis a nationwide public health emergency. And in 2019, Trump finally got the world's top fentanyl manufacturer, China, to schedule all forms of fentanyl analogs. And in October 2019, President Trump awarded $1.8 billion in grants to combat the opioid epidemic, which has empowered all of the major health and human service organizations across the nation to better educate, serve, and support individuals and families affected by the opioid epidemic. Now, it is not easy to give a snapshot of the addiction epidemic today in just a couple episodes. Even just looking at the alcohol and drug epidemics themselves, it is just so extensive, and the results are so staggering that I will have to do another series on the drug trade at some point. Additionally, remembering we are also facing an epidemic of other addictions, such as addiction to tobacco, processed foods, screens, internet, gaming, gambling, technologies, money and material things, and sex and pornography addiction. The biggest point to be made is that the addiction epidemics we see today are not by accident or surprise. Rather, every type of addiction has been manufactured and propagated into society with either great ignorance and carelessness or with a wicked agenda to maintain control over the people. Now, it is the people's responsibility not to fall for these things and to untangle from the web by solving our underlying issues, but it helps to see what is going on as motivation to get unstuck. Looking now at the layers of crisis within this epidemic, we will take a look at 3 different layers. The most inner layer is within ourselves. As human beings with so much karma and trauma, we lose our way in the search for relief, freedom, and meaning. And in this disconnection, we are susceptible and vulnerable to the addiction phenomenon. As I stated at the onset, the crisis inevitably leads back to ourselves. The bigger the epidemic, the bigger mountain we have to climb within ourselves. People have dedicated not only their daily lives, but their entire lives to drinking alcohol, spirits, smoking tobacco, doing drugs, or engaging in other addictions. On the surface, this affects psychological and physical health as emotional healing is blocked, as well as inhibits the growth and sustainability of relationships, education, career, finances, and community affairs. And deeper than this, people have forgotten and forfeited their reason for being human. And this is because addiction prevents core healing and the transformation of the true self, therefore resulting in the disconnection from God and one's spiritual cultivation path in life. Now, the next layer of crisis exists on the surface. In society, addictive things are offered, encouraged, and celebrated everywhere, or they are limited and prohibited, either way, driving people toward them. Methods to resolve addiction are one-dimensionally focused, simply separating people physically from a ritual or thing via a treatment program, incarceration or drug court, or coercion by loved ones, which typically creates a stronger yearning. The more funding that goes into punishing and treating addiction, the more people that are becoming addicted and falling deeper and deeper into addiction and dying at the hands of addiction without receiving adequate help. Now, setting blame aside, these are just the facts. Incarceration and conventional treatment are revolving doors. Looking further at the crisis on the surface, laws and policies restrict the more natural and promising plant medicines and legalize the more toxic and addictive substances. Jails and probation programs discipline criminal behavior with little to no consideration of core issues. Academic and health institutions focus on physical symptoms and surface problems and information, neglecting the depth of holistic healing. Big Pharma encourages maintenance medications despite their own toxic and addictive and sometimes fatal effects. Media and entertainment validate, normalize, and encourage the addictive lifestyle. Same with social media and internet apps. The food and beverage industry put addictive chemicals into their products to purposely get people addicted. And too many corporate executives and independent entrepreneurs are offering their own solution to addiction through yet another addictive thing. All right, lastly, from what I have seen throughout my career, the third layer of crisis exists behind the scenes. Many converging industries, directly or indirectly, or overtly or covertly, tie into the addiction epidemic, with forces at the top consciously manufacturing the addiction crisis we see today. The entire addiction industry at all ends is monopolized and being exploited by private interests. Many industries are benefiting, from the production and sales of addictive substances and things, to the remedies to mitigate the side effects and consequences, to different forms of addiction treatment, and to corrective programs to control addiction, all of which tie back into the same investor profiteers. The stakeholders are working from all angles, driving the problem, offering the solution, making sure the solution doesn't work, offering more maintenance solutions, continuing to project the problem and disguise the addictions, and keeping people locked in a cycle of hope and doom. And even deeper sits the underground cartel and mafia, who work with shadow government factions to create a supply and demand on the surface to support the underground drug trade, as I have been discussing. Take something like the war on drugs. There were many agendas within this war, with different governing factions fighting against each other. From what I see, the leaders and organizations for sovereignty of the human spirit and land of the free fought against the drug trade. But the drug trade runners were and are funded by elite money, with elite agendas to maintain power by controlling public perception and behavior. They exploited the war on drugs to launch a war against the people to further their own mission and agenda. This suggests that the addiction epidemic was manufactured by the elite powers that be using the same tactics they've always used. They put their people at the top of industries and organizations. They choose which projects and research to fund, which people to notarize and to publish, what information and narrative is told, and what services and products are sold, constantly controlling supply and demand by controlling what people see and know. All right, in wrapping up this two-part episode, I will now say a few words about the solution and where we go from here. The situation that is going on behind the scenes and on the surface, the haunting evil that is, has pretty much always been in the human dimension. It is the nature of the human world to become lost and disconnected, falling prey to the deception of the material world as a result of human baggage and attachments. But it is us as a people that allow this to happen. It is in our nature to explore and discover, find relief and happiness, and to see what we are capable of. But when these pursuits cause us as a society to turn away from our own true self and our true path in life, and when these pursuits are competing with each other, we run into crisis. Our shadow develops in the wake and makes us susceptible to the enchantment of addiction. The solution and where your power sits. Change starts with awareness. We must recognize that the addiction epidemic is as real as it gets. Each person has to identify how are you under the spell of addiction, because addiction is a program that is cast over the entire world at different spectrums, and it is conscious and it follows certain principles, which include trap humans in their habits when they externalize their power over to the material world. Pull them as deep into addiction as necessary to find God, and don't let them out until they learn their lessons, right their wrongs, and release their attachments. The only escape for humans is to forfeit and die from addiction, or cultivate with God and succeed. So you have to accept that addiction happened, whether by soul contract, life circumstance, or complete happenstance. Then you have to figure out what you have to learn, heal, and transform in order to transcend addiction. And then you can identify how addiction has a hold over you, such as what views, beliefs, fears, anxieties, attachments, and pursuits are you bound by. Following awareness comes the integration of a healthier, more positive, and truer way of being in the world. The matrix won't let go of you. You have to let go of it. In closing, the addiction crisis and epidemic is a comprehensive topic with centuries of history. So I was only able to preview the subject, touching on some major turning points as I understand things. However, there is a lot more to the history here. So please share what you see and understand in the discussion below so that we can keep the conversation going. This concludes this episode as well as the larger series on the nature of addiction. I will return to topics of addiction again in the future, but now I'm going to move to the next series on transformational recovery, getting into the upside of the addiction phenomenon and speaking in detail about how to recover from addiction. Thank you for watching this rather heavy series. I look forward to sharing the more positive aspects and the opportunities in recovery in the next series. Sending you and your family and any loved ones struggling with addiction lots of love and light, clarity and courage, and strength and blessings. Until next time.